Hey Balaji, how you doing, man?
Hey, how are you?
Doing well, doing well. So I want to introduce, today we're going to be doing a fireside chat with the one and only Balaji. Normally, Balaji does not need an intro, given that this is crypto, but just in the interest of completeness, Balaji, you were a PhD at Stanford. You co-founded a genomics company, Council. You also co-founded Earn.com and Coin Center. You were a general partner at Andreessen Horowitz. You were CTO of Coinbase, and now you are an esteemed member of the Twitterati. So you've got a very extensive background. So across all of that, you've been an academic, you've been a founder, you've been an operator, you've been an investor, and you've been an influencer. Which of these things do you wish you'd done more of, and wish you'd done less of over your career?
That's a good question. I think it's been very useful to be on multiple sides of the table. For example, as a student and teacher, as engineer and engineering manager, as entrepreneur and investor, as critic and as journalist, basically over the last several months, right? Um, because it gives you an appreciation for both sides and the incentive structures and so on, things that are not always apparent on just sitting on one side. What I actually wish I had done more of, and what I want to get more into, is actually art. So by
Was
that what
not
I mean
expecting you
is,
to say that.
yeah, I know. Like back in high school, there was a choice where either I was going to take this freehand art class, or I think it was BC calculus, or what, I don't remember. It was either a math or physics class that overlapped. But I'd always been interested actually in art, and insofar as that comes out in any of my work that I've done, I think I have reasonably okay slides. Like, I spend some time on the aesthetics of slides, but I've never formally trained on that, right? And so I'm just trying to boot that up. And one of the reasons for that is I think we're about to get into the era of decentralized Hollywood, where an individual can make full length movies and stuff on with their phones and their laptops. And there's at least two ways. First is recording video with your phone, right? TikTok has shown how high quality that can be, frankly, right? Like, it's very entertaining. People go for it. And the second is virtual influencers on your computer, so you're synthesizing it. So I'm just actually imbibing and learning art, and applied art history, maybe one of the things I'm thinking about.
What medium of art in particular are you paying attention to?
Digital. So what I think a lot about is, um, a a cryptocurrency is a prelude to a crypto country. And when you think about France, right, the first thing you think about is not their stock market. What do you think about when you think about France?
Food.
The Louvre, right? The
Oh,
Eiffel
sure.
Tower.
Okay, fine, fine, fine.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
baguettes. No, that's also important, right?
I'm clearly
Um,
not as sophisticated as you are.
no. But what you're talking about is the food and the culture, right? Like,
Uh,
when it's relatively infrequent that the first thing you think about when you think about a country, is their markets. You know, that happens. For example, like, if the USA, certainly capitalism would probably be one of the top five things that people would come up with when they're talking about what the US is. New York City and Wall Street and so on, right? So it's identified with that. Like, capitalism is part of the culture, and there's nothing wrong with that. But when you talk about culture, and a lot of it is art, a lot of it's aesthetics. And this is something that crypto and Bitcoin has started to do more of. Like, there's certainly, obviously the logo. There's folks who have memes, like moon and lunar, right? Like hodl. Those are like kind of what I call pigeon art. It's not intentional. It's not funded. It's not like meant to be inspirational. For example, there's huge holes. We don't have a Bitcoin anthem, right? We don't actually have songs. We have some documentaries and so on. We don't have like movies. We don't have art yet. And so yet, on the other hand, if you think about a huge part of what boosts cryptocurrency, it is, like the community, right? And so again, we have the pigeon version of that. We have Twitter, obviously, and we have Reddit, and we have blog posts and whatnot. You have sort of text-based evangelism, but one thought is that text only works for a subset of people, And then to reach like a larger audience, it is going to have to be video. It's going to have to be songs. It's going to have to be images. It's going to have to be things that are maybe more feeling than just pure thinking. This is actually also related to something I've been tweeting about, which is we haven't made the emotional case for technology. We have only talked about the costs and benefits from a very left brain analytical perspective. It's 10x faster, it's 10x cheaper, it's more efficient or what have you. We haven't said something like, hey, if you are blocking self-driving cars, you're killing 30,000 people a year from car accidents. We haven't made that moral case. We haven't said, hey, the FDA is stopping genetic tests, and so therefore it is literally killing people by like disabling our sensors around the coronavirus. We haven't said, hey, the SEC is preventing capital formation, is keeping you poor because you can't invest, right? We haven't made that moral and emotional case. It's like this huge missing thing. And this is kind of related to that. Anyway, maybe a long answer, but something you might be interested in.
No, it's interesting. We might come back to that at some point when we talk more about crypto. But so the theme of this particular interview is about COVID-19 and how it changes everything.
Sure.
So you've, of course, been in the spotlight lately because of your impressions on the COVID-19 pandemic. I remember, in our conversations, you were one of the earliest lucid voices that I heard, claiming that COVID-19 was going to come to the US, that it was going to be big, and that it was going to disrupt the world and even spark social unrest. And so far, you've been vindicated on every count. But I want to ask you, what do you think you got wrong in your predictions about how this would play out? And what has most surprised you in the way that the pandemic has progressed through the world?
Yeah, I was actually going to say, I would not call myself vindicated on every count. If I score myself, Scott Alexander actually has, and Brian Kaplan, they both have this really good exercise of self-scoring their own predictions, both as a public accountability mechanism and as a personal accountability mechanism. What did I get wrong? Because when I have a theory of the world that is disproved by events, I've learned something, and then hopefully I can update, right? In statistical signal processing, like you think about the Kalman filter, this so-called innovations process, where the deltas actually feed back in, and then you change the trajectory of your space shuttle or what have you that's guided in this way. That's like basic control theory. So without that feedback, you don't actually change your course correction. So what do I think I got wrong? I'd say the biggest thing that I got wrong was I underestimated the degree of ADD and irrationalism among the American public. Despite actually thinking of that at a pretty high level, it's actually off the charts in an unquantifiable way. Okay, and basically with COVID, the country went from, it was almost like the classic Gartner hype cycle, right? Ignore it. Oh my God, it's the most important thing ever. Then it went away for like 2 weeks or 3 weeks when we have all these protests and what have you, right? Huge crowds, obviously, and then suddenly it surges back. Oh my God, and this may be something that everybody has different root causes of it. I frankly think if you take all the accusations on one side and all the accusations on the other side and you put them together, they're both right. Masks, if you don't wear a mask, probably going to spread it. You're more likely to get it. If you're in a huge crowd, probably more likely to get it. That's just like basic biology 101. The virus doesn't care how righteous one's cause is, and so essentially what I got wrong was I thought that the level of energy around stay home, stay safe. Do you remember when the guy was on a beach and he had like a Grim Reaper, thing? Like,
Yeah.
do you remember that? Yep.
Yeah.
So like that was there, and that was being celebrated by all these people on Twitter, literally like 2 weeks before these gigantic, closely packed protests, right? And you can argue maybe that, all right, hey, this is like higher in the priority stack, like one can argue about that, like, oh, maybe this saves more lives or what have you. Okay, but you can't argue that it's not going to spread the virus, right? And so the level of kind of irrationalism has been much higher than I expected. And of course, this is very much a universal thing. It's actually insane that you can't discuss a biological phenomenon without it becoming partisan in America, right? What happened very quickly was people, rather than fighting the virus, were much more comfortable fighting each other. And so it mapped onto this stupid right-left template that we have for basically everything. For example, remdesivir is, championed by the left and hydroxychloroquine by the right. Can you imagine like, uh, like some sort of treatment of a normal flu where like amoxicillin or whatever is considered right wing, and like Robitussin is left wing or whatever? Like that's
Yeah.
insane. It's something where that should just be like a scientific process, right? You shouldn't
Mm.
have these lunatics, making it partisan, right?
Right.
But that's what we've got. So that's what go ahead.
It's interesting because I think what COVID has shown us is that if COVID were more straightforward, if it were like, like the Black Death,
Yeah.
then it would be a lot easier for people to calibrate correctly to, just new social norms that everybody follows without really thinking too much about it. But it seems like COVID is all about externalities, right? Like even a mask protects other people more than it protects you, right?
Yeah.
And sort of social behavior going out, especially if you're young and you're relatively in good health, right? It seems like a lot of the, at least to my perspective, a lot of the difference in behavior and performance between different countries has to do with their norms around sort of community versus individual identity.
Yeah, so that's another thing where I think COVID has affected my thinking on philosophy. I don't consider, I wouldn't say I got this wrong. Actually, I think I thought through this early enough in the thing, in the whole, pandemic, and I tweeted about it, where basically there's definitely a tension between the level of state power capacity that you need to fight COVID and the ideals of cryptocurrency and small L libertarianism and freedom and what have you, right? There's absolutely a tension there between antivirus and pro crypto. However, early on I had this tweet, which was Ben Gurion, one of the first leaders of Israel. He had this saying, "Fight the war as if there is no white paper. Fight the white paper as if there is no war." Meaning, during World War II, the British had put out a white paper on the disposition of Palestine that the proto-Israelis were not happy with, and so they were against the British on this issue. On the other hand, they were allied with the British against the Nazis, and so even though that these two goals clearly had differing things, one was basically allied with the British and one was very much against them. He recognized that actually he wanted both outcomes, which is both wanted to defeat the Nazis and wanted to have an independent Israel. So he said, fight the war as if there was no white paper, fight the white paper as if there was no war. And they got both of them, right? So over time, they both defeated the Nazis and they got an independent state, right? And I'm not getting into there's lots of politics or whatever. I'm just talking about that particular, strategy, right? Similarly, I think, fight the virus, fight COVID as if there is no crypto, fight for crypto as if there's no COVID. What gets interesting is you don't want to undermine a legitimate quarantine regime, because that's not only not in your self-interest, that is arguably violating like the non-aggression principle and so on, because you're visiting harm, potentially lethal harm, on other people, right? And again, I wouldn't call myself like a narrow libertarian, but just if one is going by those principles. On the other hand, certainly COVID has been cover for this incredible roll-up of power, where there's lots of TSA style policies, a cargo cult lockdown where, basically the US just completely wasted everything it did. Trillions of dollars was incinerated. There was this totally performative TSA style cargo cult lockdown, which was a copy of Italy, which was itself a copy of China, without admitting, the US couldn't admit that it was copying China. So it copied it through a proxy. It was this really bizarre elite discourse where folks, either thought of China as a third world country or something. They didn't realize that actually China is in many ways, very technically sophisticated, very good at execution, and especially in the physical world. And if they were having trouble containing this, well, then the US was going to have big trouble. And it seemed only real for people when it hit Italy, and then Italy did a lockdown, and then the US copied that. But the problem is when you do a copy of a copy, and I tweeted about this as well, and you're in denial about the fact that you're copying, well, the only thing they copied was the dumbest possible instruction, which is stay home, stay safe, right? There's like 50 other things that, Asian countries did, not just China, but like Taiwan and others, And not every one of them did all of these things, but for example, they had central quarantine. So if you had the disease, you weren't actually kept at home where you could spread it. You went to central quarantine. Obviously, there was testing everywhere. There was testing like with thermometers and at restaurants and certainly at airports and other places. So you had constant check-ins. They closed borders early on. They had in China they had mobile uh, imaging machines, so they could do CT scans of people's lungs as a proxy or as an alternative complement in some cases to genetic testing, and so on and so forth. There's like a whole list of things. Taiwan itself had like a 52-point plan, so it wasn't just like stay in your room, right? So the U.S. managed to basically ignore it until it basically panicked and pooped its pants and and literally just incinerated trillions of dollars basically for almost nothing. Almost none of that initial bill was actually allocated towards, to my knowledge at least, biomedicine or drugs or vaccines or treatments or fast track. It was all just treating the thing as a financial crisis, treating it as an economic or a political problem as opposed to a biological problem. And then now everybody came out of lockdown with zero plan. And so you just got the worst of all worlds, right? And again, you can look at my tweets in March, and that's kind of like, I think we're going to get the worst of all worlds, where we're going to get a lockdown that destroys the economy, and we're going to have the worst outbreak in the world. And that's what American leadership at all levels has delivered.
Very true. So let's turn the subject from COVID to crypto.
Sure.
So it's been claimed by many people that COVID is going to accelerate crypto adoption. It's been 6 months now, roughly, that COVID has been spreading around the world. Has it been accelerating crypto adoption? And if not, what exactly is it going to take for that accelerant to really take place?
I think it's so I'm not sure that I don't know, maybe I have a tweet or something on this. I don't think that COVID specific, it's not like an A to B, it's more of an A to B to C. What COVID does is COVID powered up the state everywhere, right? Mm-hmm. Like, things that were previously edge cases, like, surveillance, house arrest of everybody, control of the economy, all of these things, like there are now reasons where, the state basically says, hey, we need to contact trace you, right? We need to track everybody you've ever associated with. Okay, number one. Number two, we need to put you under house arrest, even if you haven't committed a crime. Like you can be, like basically yacked off the street, like there's a curfew, right? Number three, imports, exports, tariffs, all of that is on the table. Like any economic intervention, print $1 trillion, tell Walmart that there's non-essential goods and they can't sell it, tell a restaurant that it has to, basically implement biohazard mode or shut down, just anything is possible. We're in the time of the unlimited government, right? Seize masks, seize things on the basis of them being hoarded. We're just outside the bounds of any limits on government economically, right? So what COVID has done is it's just unleashed the state completely. Now here's the thing. I had this kind of doggerel or whatever, which I thought was funny, and everyone gets may get offended by it, but I do not mean any offense. But it was basically like Democrats need to learn that experts are sometimes wrong. Republicans need to learn that experts are sometimes right. Progressives need to learn that a state can sometimes fail, and libertarians need to learn that a state can sometimes succeed. And that, to me, like, is the kind of non-ideological take on the last 4 months, where every one of the sentences you can immediately pull some incidents to mind where people are either like mindlessly trusting experts or mindlessly dismissing them, or they're saying, oh, like anything the government does is obviously bad, or anything the government does we must obey without question, right? Now, the point, of course, is there's an enormous parameter space in the middle. And what I've increasingly realized is our actual form of government is in the US and much of the West is no longer the Constitution or, like regulators even, or, academics, journalists. You know what our form of government is? Twitter. Twitter is the supreme force in Western civilization. Okay, it stands above Trump and the Times. Okay,
uh,
because Trump can't post something online if Twitter doesn't want it to, and neither can Sulzberger at the Times, right? Within the
mm,
span of basically 10 days in different ways, Twitter edited both Trump and the Times, right? And so Twitter is now actually the supreme force in Western civilization, but it wasn't set up to be a government. You wanted e-voting? We got it, right? Like basically a politician goes and floats some proposal and they count how many likes and replies. It's a new, phone into your senator or whatever. They just count the flames or what have you. It's extremely influential on their thinking.
mm.
And I sort of sarcastically remarked, people say that Western civilization has no telos, no sense of purpose or direction. I'm like, are you kidding? The purpose of every single journalist, academic, influencer, politician in Western civilization is very clear, which is to gain more likes and followers on Twitter, right? And so like once you actually phrase it like that, it's actually kind of true that all of them value that. They don't necessarily share common like ideological goals. They may not believe in the flag or something like that, but they believe in followers. And I mean, I'm being sarcastic, but it's also unfortunately true, right? And the problem, of course, is that status and attention are fundamentally zero-sum games. This is a deeper concept. Let me go into this for a second, but in if everybody has a Nobel Prize, nobody has a Nobel Prize, right? The entire point of the Nobel Prize is, out of 7 billion people, you're picking a few people for this honor, right? The more it's expanded, the less exclusive it is, the less, of an honor it is or what have you, right? And so status is inherently zero sum in this way, right? If, if you've got a leaderboard and there's 10 people and the first guy has 100 votes, now let's say everybody got 10x the number of votes, the first guy has 1,000 votes, he's still number one, and so attention is still there, right? Status and attention are zero sum because they're leaderboards, right? One person's gain is another person's loss. It's inherently zero sum. Now the interesting thing about it is locally it appears non-zero sum because when you give somebody else an upvote, it doesn't seem to cost you anything and it seems to increase them. So it seems to cost you 0 and give them a +1. And so locally, it seems like it doesn't cost you anything. It's positive sum, right? Because sum up the two things. You had 0 status, you still have 0.
Mm.
This guy had 0 status, now he has +1. Seems positive sum. But globally, it's zero sum since your gain is their loss and vice versa, right? It's very deep actually, and what it comes to is because there's a renormalization. There's everything is being divided by a divisor, and by you giving that, even though you don't think you're giving yourself a negative, you actually are because your status is decreasing by like a certain amount relative to that other one. It's like a whenever you link to a site and don't do no follow, you're actually putting that site above you in search rankings, for example, typically, right? At least according to the original PageRank. Now, with capitalism, though, it's the opposite. It appears locally zero sum because you give somebody $5 and you're a -5 and they're a +5, right? So it seems that sums to 0. However, globally, it's not zero sum because if everybody has a cell phone, then it's actually better that everybody has a cell phone. It's actually wealth increasing. There's a network effect and so on, right? It's not like, the Nobel Prize, or if everybody has a Nobel Prize, nobody has one, right? If everybody has a cell phones are more valuable, right? And other goods are like that as well, So what's the difference here? Well, when you gave that person $5, something flowed the other way. They gave you a Coca-Cola, or they gave you, a piece of paper or a notepad or whatever it is, right? They gave you something of value. So both of you actually ended up with more of what you wanted. This is the whole coincidence of wants kind of thing, right? So the fundamental issue then, backing it up, is that leaders in Western civilization have come to play this incredible zero-sum game of Twitter, right, which is our actual government, and wasn't set up to be a government. Twitter was set up to tweet your breakfast, right? Twitter was not set up to think about checks and balances. It certainly doesn't really have a police force beyond the most arbitrary flagging of posts, which people make fun of, by the way. If you Google like 5G frequency or whatever, you've seen these things, right? You can tweet things and Twitter will put a warning underneath, and it's just like a dumb regex. It's looking for words in your tweet to like warn you of it, right? So Twitter wasn't set up to be a government. And look, I'm not attacking Jack. This thing started as tweeting, one's breakfast, and it grew to something that literally heads of state are angry about whether they can or cannot write to Twitter's database. This is also a deep point, by the way. Like, people talk about, oh, the president's the most powerful man in the world. No, the president isn't even the most powerful man in his own country because like Dorsey and Zuck can control whether or not he's able to post online, right? Like, That's a totally new thing, right? Same with the press. Like the press is no longer the primary thing because Dorsey or Zuck can up or down prioritize them, right? Um, so, all right, remind me where my initial train of thought was, because I got into Twitter and leadership for a reason.
Yeah, we were originally talking about COVID accelerating crypto adoption, and
Mm,
I think we ended up
okay, yeah.
going a
So
few function
so
calls
here's what's
deep.
happened. COVID has massively powered up the state. In some countries, um, that state has, for the most part, taken that power and used it responsibly. So for example, Singapore has privacy preserving contact tracing and has managed to mostly get their epidemic under control. Um, I haven't looked at the last few weeks in New Zealand, so like my news might be a little bit out of date on this. But New Zealand did for a while get to 0 new cases. Then they had large protests and so on, which may have brought it back. I haven't actually looked at the last few days, but New Zealand, for at least a time, did have a competent government that used their powers for good, right? And this is the thing that libertarians often, that they're ideologically against it, because they're correct in saying a state can fail, but a state can also succeed. And there's certain things that are hard to do unless you do them centralized. So it's not the case that every government failed. It is the case that every government powered up. And it is the case that every government powered up and gained lots of powers over the economy, right? To basically just pause transactions and so on. Bruno McKay's, had a good essay on this, where he basically said, look, the economy is now a program, and we all learned something that we didn't know before. The Hayekian model of it all being free exchange and so on is one model, but there's another model where this is a program that you can just hit pause on and halt it, right? And there's a depth to that in the sense of if you're PayPal, if you're Stripe, if you're the Federal Reserve, if you're looking at a blockchain, an economy is no longer an abstract thing. It's a data structure, right? It is a record of all the transactions that have ever happened along with metadata on each edge. In the same way that in the late 90s, people talked about 6 degrees of separation as a sort of abstract concept. And then we had the social network, which is a very concrete thing that you can compute on. You don't just say 6 degrees of separation. I can give you like a time series of the degree of every node and all these analytics, right? It's a data structure, right? So now the economy is a data structure. Now people realize it can be paused, it can be edited, it can be analyzed. So that means enormous amounts of temptation and probably result of state control over the economy. And that is what stimulates crypto in the medium to long term.
So I think much of the cryptoification of the world thesis assumes that technology is this kind of neutral, permissionless substrate that anybody can co-opt, right? They can write whatever code they want to run on whatever hardware they have. But it seems like recently we've been seeing an increasing dividing lines, showing us that it's not quite so neutral of a substrate. So, for example, India banning Chinese applications from the app stores, right? Or Google and Facebook enforcing COVID apps from not being able to be deployed onto mobile, or the Chinese firewall, or Russia trying to import the Chinese firewall, or the EU, for that matter, trying to import their own version of a firewall. How does that affect the storyline of how crypto gains a chokehold if sort of, as you mentioned, states are powering up, and they're particularly powering up around their control over the internet?
Yeah. So what I think happens is we're in for an era. It's funny. Like it was either December 31st or January 1st. I tweeted something like a decade of disruption followed by a decade of decentralization, right? And I think that's holding up pretty well, actually, in some ways. So, but an interesting point, which is we're both decentralizing and centralizing at the same time. And let me explain. The virus breaks centralized states. Any state that is incompetent is basically going to face de facto independence movements. For example, in the EU, down to the individual city level, Italian cities are like banning people from entering. They're doing border control to prevent people from entering, right? And the EU is like this huge new hit of the pandemic came on top of all their existing tensions over politics and immigration and economics and what have you. And then this new force has just been pushing people apart, right? So I think the EU is not long for this world. Brexit is obviously the first country, the UK breaking away from the EU. But I would be very surprised if the EU makes it through this decade, right? It's already in some ways a dead letter, because when the pandemic hit, their first instinct wasn't to cooperate and act as one. Like India is actually one country. It didn't like break up in the same way, which is interesting. India is actually in some ways got higher state capacity and internal cohesion than Europe or even the US nowadays, which is astonishing, by the way. Um, the but the point being that it decentralizes, so it breaks into these states, but then within those states they centralize and they gain more power, right? So it's simultaneously decentralization of breaking down, and then you have like more authority within that locality than you did globally, right? And arguably that's a better outcome, where rather than some person having like, kind of wishy-washy bureaucratic control over, a huge group of people, you have n, CEOs who actually have control, and therefore they have not just responsibility but power to accomplish things. And at least in theory, you can exit from one to another, right? Now, in practice, you can't right now because of COVID. That has put all these immigration restrictions on people. But I think that's another thing which is interesting. All of my stuff on exit, and so on from 2013, right? And exit as a fundamental human right. I think people are going to value that way more once it's taken away from them,
Hmm.
right? Like the fact that you cannot leave, that you're in lockdown in your home, or that it's hard to get out of the country is, or, UK people are also feeling this with Brexit, oh, my ability to leave is being impeded. It's not even so much that you want to use it right then, it's that it was taken away from you. And now it's like, oh, my freedom to travel is gone, right?
Right.
So that's another aspect in which, this decentralization and centralization combined, it boosts the energy for thinking about exit as a fundamental right. Now, return to your question, though. You said something about. I want to make sure I answered all of it.
The question of whether the neutrality of technology is going to be
Yes. Okay.
maintained going
I'll come
forward.
to that point. So you have this decentralization. You have these states powering up, right? And as they power up, they do things like what India has just done, where they like knock Chinese apps out and so on. Now, not every state is capable of doing that. You have to be sort of like an anchor tenant. Like India is an anchor tenant, and arguably like Sri Lanka or Bangladesh maybe could be friendly with it, right? Pakistan probably not. Nepal maybe, right? Um, China is also an anchor tenant, and Vietnam and others could be under its sort of sphere of influence, so to speak, right? Um, and so you have these anchor tenants, and they have spheres of influence, right? And the USA would probably, it'd have Canada, it'd have the UK, and it'd have New Zealand, et cetera. But it doesn't have China in its sphere of influence as much anymore, right? Um, so what you get is I don't know, maybe 6 or 7 spheres of influence. Roughly speaking, there's the Anglosphere, right? There is the Visegrad, right, which is Hungary, Slovakia, basically 4 countries in Central/Eastern Europe. You have the Russians and Belarus and so on, kind of the Slav sphere. You have the Chinese. You have India. You have Japan, which is its own thing, right? And Korea is interesting. Maybe that's also capable of it's got Naver. It's got quite a competent tech ecosystem. And then like big piece of Africa will probably be siding with China, for a while, because there's a lot of Chinese boots on the ground there. South America, I don't actually know as well. Who would be the anchor tenant there? Maybe it'll end up being the U.S. or something, but I actually don't know as well. So you've got like, I don't know, maybe 6 or 8 of these spheres of influence around the world, and you have just like we talk about. Alibaba is the Chinese Amazon, right? You'll probably get a Russian Amazon and maybe a Visegrad Amazon and a South American Amazon, which is like Mercado Libre by Wences. So you basically get, I don't know, 8 of these spheres, and you have different versions within each. So you actually have more choice in the sense of internet giants, and one of the reasons is it's easier to clone, right? Once you know that something works, you can copy Amazon's UX, you copy Facebook's UX. It's something where those UXs have been stable for a while, so you can just clone them. Okay, so it'll probably work within these things. You have these protected spheres. And then between, the internet is like the ocean. Okay, so you know what the law of the sea is?
The international law?
Law of the SEAE. Oh,
Oh,
so
what
not
is that?
SEA, SEA, right? So the oceans have long been effectively, and I shouldn't say a demilitarized zone, but they've been something where, you know, you'll have a Portuguese ship flying near France and England or what have you. So there's been need for a long time when there's this international waters kind of area, right? To have
Mm.
laws that govern the interactions of ships, like they get in a fight or they crash into each other and they're 30 miles outside of, you know, or more than 30 miles outside, it's like in the middle of the Atlantic. What happens, right? So the law of the sea is worth studying because it governs what happens in this no man's land, right? It governs what
Mm.
happens when ships go and hit. And I think that's a model that we're moving towards. We have these powerful spheres, and then in between them, the interstices, that's the internet and that's crypto.
Mm.
Okay.
Interesting.
So blockchain is the law of the sea or the law of the internet. And so, you know, folks who cannot like collaborate, it's basically the place where internationalist capitalism happens, even as all these countries go nationalist socialist. And so that's what I mean. You've got both, you know, decentralization and centralization, you know, they become these countries,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
In the same way, you have a huge push for centralization within the countries, and then there's actually a corresponding demand of some kind of free trade zone in between, right? And you can rationalize this in the following sense, which is there's roughly two modalities that people will accept, right? A, we have total power. B, no one has power over us,
Mm.
right? And these two things are kind of the two parts of the spectrum, right? A, we have total power, meaning, you know, for example, India has power over these apps, right? Like Indians will figure out what, you know, who's eavesdropping on them or whatever. It's not TikTok, right?
Right. Right.
Um, or or it's a technology like Bitcoin or, you know, Ethereum, where it's open state, open source, open execution, totally inspectable, totally transparent, and it's more like mathematics, where it's a property of the world, so nobody can deprive you, or no one has power over it, right? Now, of
Mm.
course, it's an idealization because there's still human beings who are reading and writing to the blockchain, and I'm aware that, you know, I don't know, maybe Russians may be more friendly to Ethereum because, you know, or Russians and Canadians might like it more because, you know, Vitalik, right?
Right.
And that's fine. You know, I think Ethereum is actually quite neutral in general. Bitcoin's even more neutral because there isn't a founder around, right? So at least in terms of optics, right?
So actually,
Go ahead.
apology. We're right up on the end of time, so I think we'll end it there. But that was a fascinating note to end on. Anything you'd like people to do to follow you or to keep up with your stuff?
Well, follow at Balajis, Balajis, at Twitter, and you know, if I launch something new, I'll tweet out.
Excellent. Awesome. Well, thanks for joining me for this conversation. It was fun.